Okay, well, welcome to everybody. Glad to see everybody here today. We're going to talk about between the wars today. It'll be a little, well, there won't be any battles, for example. We'll be talking basically about technology and how things changed and how the Second Industrial Revolution really made a difference. And probably the picture up here seems probably a little strange to everybody, but what that is that's a picture of Nobel laureate physicist Ernest Rutherford's laboratory. And you can see that it doesn't really look much like a laboratory we would see today, especially with all those loose wires hanging around. But I thought it was fitting for what we would be talking about today. But before we get there, let us talk about the question we received last week. And the question was, how much does the ammunition weigh on a Fokker-Eindecker Model 3? And we really need to look at more than just the ammunition. We need to look at the fact that the Eindecker 3 had a IMG-08 machine gun. That was the standard German machine gun. It had been converted from water-cooled to air-cooled. The water-cooled version without water weighed 58 pounds. I believe this one probably weighed about 50 pounds because of these holes that they put in it for basically air conditioning. Then, of course, you have the ammunition itself, which weighs 37 grams per bullet. And Eindecker had 500 rounds of ammunition, so that would be approximately 41 pounds. Of course, then you have the mounts, you have the belts, you've got the synchronization gear, you have all these other things. So I took a rough estimate, and I would say that the entire weight of the armament of this aircraft was approximately 120 pounds. So the aircraft itself weighs 880 pounds dry weight, and its gross weight is 1,345 pounds. So you can see that this weapon accounted for nearly 10% of its total weight. Well, if we look at it that way, and we realize that this thing only has a 100 horsepower Oberusel rotary engine, then of course we would understand that this is a significant part of weight for this little aircraft. So indeed, it weighed a lot, Ellen. Yes?
Didn't any of the biplanes fighting carry two guns?
Oh, absolutely.
So you gave us the information.
That was the one we were talking about. The Eindecker. Yes, for example, a SPAD, I'll just throw this out, I just happen to know, a SPAD carrying two machine guns carried 800 rounds of ammunition with approximately the same weight, so you'll have to do the math on that one. Okay, anyway, let us get started. Well, we talked this, you've seen this slide before. This is in regards to the Second Industrial Revolution, which takes place from 1867 till 1914. And that was an era where we would be able to get steel produced. Steel would make steel rails for railroads. Railroads will expand greatly. We see things like the internal combustion engine made. We see the telephone. Because of the internal combustion engine, we see early aircraft. We see this synergy between engineering and science that leads to the Second Industrial Revolution and makes it so incredibly a time of really change within the world. Well, after World War I, there's going to be still that same synergy, but it's going to be even more focused on science. So you're going to have weapons made that are created by this new synergy. You're going to have countermeasures to the weapons of your enemy. You're going to be more and more focused on things like light metals for aircraft. You're going to be focused on electronics and a lot of things that really weren't available in World War I. So it's going to be very, very important between the wars and going into World War II for science to be put to war. And you'll see this with the British. They will literally recruit scientists before World War II. They had a list of 5,000 that they wanted to help with their war effort. Well, I would imagine this looks like a strange picture for a military history class, But this thing actually is amazing that this is the Audion tube from 1908. It is the first triode. So you might ask, well, why is that important? Well, the importance of the triode is very simple. Is because this will make radio able to be a mass communication. It will make radio the capability so that I can hear me speak, I can hear music. None of that would be possible without this system. And the biggest piece with this thing, I think, is the fact that the Audion tube comes out before World War I. And it's not used, though, during World War I. It would have made such a huge difference in the war. So the Audion tube, simply enough, what it does is it has the ability to amplify radio signals. Now, when I had a Marconi type radio, I could only basically do Morse code. And I had a crystal radio, I would have to wear headphones that I could barely hear. With the Audion tube, you will see a total change now where I can have regular voice radio or amplitude modulation, which most of you would probably know as AM radio. And this thing will just change the world, in effect, because I can now have radio broadcasts. I can have television. I can have this machine right here is run that way. Otherwise, I would just be talking. So all these things come from this Audion tube. And also, as far as telecommunications go, telephones could only go 800 miles before this. With the Audion tube in Bell Laboratories, in 1915, they make the first transcontinental telephone call in the United States. So this thing really, really changes pretty much everything that we're aware of. Oh, by the way, television and talking movies. Yes?
Could you tell us something about DeForest who invented that? I think it was Stephen DeForest.
DeForest, yes.
He's almost unknown in today's world for his contribution.
Yes, he is pretty much unknown. A lot of these people really are unknown. I mean, who knows about Fritz Haber and the fact that he feeds half the world with his technology that he developed. So, yes, indeed, DeForest is not exactly a household name, but you obviously knew about him. Okay, well, the first group to use radio communications is actually in Australia. It's a police constable. His name is Downey. And he thinks that this is a great idea because instead of having his police officers stop at the nearest telephone booth or a phone box, he decides he's going to put radios in all their cars. And indeed, in 1923, he does put radios in all their cars. So now they have this radio. It is rather large. It takes up the entire back seat of their Lancia vehicle. And it only can broadcast on one channel. But indeed, he's seen this potential of this voice over air technology for his police force. And the problem with it is, though, is only one person could talk at a time. And still, even in World War II, you'll see the same thing. So even though radios now have multiple channels, if I'm in a fighter squadron, the discipline needs to be learned that people can't all talk at one time because they just scramble everybody's signal. So it becomes really critical to develop radio discipline. And you'll see this particularly in carrier battles, early carrier battles of World War II. The United States carrier pilots were not exactly the best with maintaining radio discipline. So, but again, the first use, 1923, pretty early. Well, the next thing that comes along is in 1937, Donald Hings comes up with an idea where he's going to make radios man-portable. And he comes up with what he calls the pack set. And the pack set, we would refer to it as a walkie-talkie. Now, I know many people think a walkie-talkie, and the term has become interchangeable, is this thing that looks like a big brick, and you see it in war movies. Well, the fact of the matter is that is actually a handy-talkie, and that's not developed until a crash program in 1940 and issued in 1942. But what has this really changed? This has changed something that we've talked about perhaps at the Battle of the Somme. So battles at that time, to break that trench stalemate, relied on timing. As a general, the only thing I could really do was make this giant orchestrated plan. And that orchestrated plan would include artillery barrage. And the artillery barrage would be timed. So at X time, the artillery is falling here. The infantry is supposed to follow behind it. Then 10 minutes later, let's say, it moves 100 yards, and then the infantry is following behind it. Well, what happens is, of course, if the infantry can't keep up, and they're trapped at the barbed wire, and the barrage continues to march forward, the Germans will pop up out of their trenches at the Somme and mow down that infantry. With this capability, I can now communicate with the infantry and say, don't advance, we're not ready to go yet, and keep firing at X position. So this will change how we look at how to break that trench stalemate. It is incredibly important, and it was only a matter of a few years, if you think about it, 1923, 1937, where there would have been a capability to communicate much more effectively back to that artillery and perhaps broken that trench stalemate. So this is really, really important development in warfare, the ability to have much closer command and control with your frontline units. What else is going to break that trench stalemate? Well, of course, that was thought to be the tank. And the tank is going to take massive amounts of changes in this time frame. So the tanks we used to look at, those big giant rhomboid-shaped things, will need to be transformed into something that's much faster, something that has better ground speed over rough terrain, and we will begin to see tanks change immensely. I think this is kind of humorous, it's tankette. So, but anyway, I personally don't think I'd want to ride around in one of those. That'd be me. Well, a couple of guys that are very, very famous, JFC Fuller, have different theories of what tank warfare is going to be like in the future. And Fuller thinks what we need to do is we need to make massive amounts of tanks, and we blast them through the line, and they cause all this havoc behind the lines. Basil Littlehart, a historian, thinks that this isn't such a great idea. What we need to do is we need to have more of a combined arms capability. And that combined arms capability would not just be for a massive offensive capability, but would be able to have defensive and more basic structure. So basically he wants armored infantry and armored mobile artillery, whereas Fuller is basically just wants a big tank force that goes really quickly through the line. Well, this leads us to the British Experimental Mechanized Force of 1927. And the British come up with an idea. They need to see how this works out. So what they're going to do is they're going to have a war game. And it's going to be on the Salisbury Plain in England. And look at this like kind of like capture the flag. Okay, so there's an infantry division has a mission to capture one little area. And the Experimental Mechanized Force has another goal to capture another little area. And this starts out where the Experimental Mechanized Force is kicking butt. They're doing a great job. They're advancing. But the Mechanized Force, because of the limitations of their vehicles, has to stop at night, refuel, tighten up their tracks, do a lot of maintenance. The infantry force, on the other hand, decides it's going to launch a night march. And the mechanized force sees this going on, but they don't have any radios. So what they do is they send a motorcycle guy to get dispatches back to their headquarters to warn them. Well, the motorcycle breaks down, and the infantry division captures this flag, this objective, and even though they're completely surrounded by the mechanized force, in reality they'd be in a bad position, they are declared the winner. So what this tells us is that there was a lot of old infantry people running these games, and they didn't really draw the correct conclusions from what they saw. So the experimental mechanized forces eventually disbanded. That gets us to Heinz Guderian, pretty famous guy for World War II. Heinz Guderian writes a book called Achtung Panzer, and it means attention armor. And he, after the war, gets, I think, a relatively inflated opinion of what he actually accomplished. Not that he didn't accomplish things, don't get me wrong. But he was really more of a front man for a group. He was an ardent Nazi, and he had the ear of the Nazi Party. So he gets a lot more press than he probably should have. And I think he's relatively, as far as the last piece from Wikipedia here, that the English General Staff ignored, didn't read his book, yada, yada. I don't really feel that's necessarily accurate. But Heinz really did have some good things that he did as far as creating the panzer divisions. He thought, for example, they should be combined arms, much like Little Heart. He thought that they should also include air power, that tactical air power would pave the way for the panzer divisions. But his real piece was the fact that he was the person that made the communications of the panzer divisions so important. He felt that all tanks should have radios. He had a command vehicle that was stuffed full of radios, so he could control his units. The other key thing that he did was the logistics of panzer divisions. So once a panzer division breaks through what we would call the trench line in World War I, how do you then get them fuel and ammunition and everything once they've broken through this battlefield? That was something he worked on very, very thoroughly, and realized that the key to panzer divisions in the future would just not be their off-road capability, but their ability to capture road networks. And we'll see that very, very much. Perhaps something that would be very common would be the Battle of Bastogne. The Germans want to capture Bastogne from the American paratroops so badly because that is a major road network. They need that road network for logistics so their armor can continue to move forward. So he does help make blitzkrieg possible, but I think he's a bit overrated. Well, the tank itself, again, is going to change immensely. So these big, giant rhomboid tanks we saw in World War I had no suspension. So they could only travel very, very slowly over rough ground. At the best, a Mark IV British tank would be able to make 4 miles per hour over very, very level ground. So the desire is now to make tanks quicker over these ground, and one of the key people in this development is a man called J. Walter Christie. J. Walter Christie, to put it mildly, is difficult to work with. He is a pain in the ass, is what he really is. So Christie, though, is a great engineer and comes up with the Christie suspension system, and this makes tanks much more able to traverse rough ground. The other thing he wants to do is he wants tanks to be fast and relatively light and be able to travel long distances. So Christie's tanks are more on the JFC Fuller style of a tank. And he comes up with a 338 horsepower tank in 1927. Now remember, the British tanks in World War I were, I think, 135 horse, moving those giant things around. His tanks are fast. They're really fast. Well, he comes also up with a thing called convertible drive. What he wants to do is he wants a tank to not wear its tracks out, because the tracks are very, very easy to damage, especially if you have to travel long distances. They need to be tightened very periodically, well, pretty much every day for some models. And he says, well, that's what we're going to do, is we're going to make a tank where you can take the tracks off, it can run on its own road wheels. And in 1931, he gets one of his tanks with the tracks off running on road wheels to go 104 miles per hour. That's a mighty damn fast tank. Now, it can't go off-road doing that, but it certainly can do that. But the Christie suspension is a huge advantage and is, for example, used on almost all the British light tanks in World War II. It is used on the Russian BT series, and the BT series will evolve into the very famous, and perhaps many people think war-winning, T-34 Russian tank that defeats the Wehrmacht in World War II. By the way, the United States never buys a Christie suspension because they just don't really like Christie. So that brings us to air racing. Now, many people wouldn't realize this, but air racing is incredibly important to the development of aircraft. Air racing plays a huge part. And this is one of my favorite aircraft. It's really a weird little thing. It's called the GBR, and I'll just get to this quickly. It's really dangerous to fly one of these, just so you know. But if you don't want to have a long lifetime, this is a plane to fly. So air racing starts out in 1909, and it's very, very humble beginning. There are 4 entrants in France, by the way. There's 4 entrants. 2 of them can't get their planes off the ground. 2 of them do get their planes off the ground. 1 of them actually manages to fly half of the course, and he is declared the winner. It's not exactly a great start, but it is 1909. But air racing will lead to developments in how airplanes are made, how wind resistant they are. It will lead to vast improvements in engines and also in fuel. So after World War I, the nations of the world all were downsizing their militaries. So there was a huge scramble to try to get funding by the aviators to continue to develop aircraft. They're not particularly successful. They try really hard at this. But aviation itself is huge. People love airplanes. They're going crazy for aircraft. It's just amazing how much they like them. Because it's new, and of course you had all the heroic fighter races in World War I, and people are really into this. So companies and individuals begin to offer cash prizes to have air races. And air races, I mean, today this seems weird, but they would draw crowds of 200,000 people, absolutely no problem. They get tremendous amounts of press. It was a very, very big deal to have an air race. And the people that were in these air races, people like Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, Jimmy Doolittle, these people were like rock stars. So they became, in effect, the fighter aces of this era. Well, the most important single race was called the Schneider Trophy. I need to describe the Schneider Trophy just a little bit, the way this worked, because it's a little confusing. The Schneider Trophy was a seaplane race. So what they wanted to do at the time was there weren't a lot of airports, and most airports were just grass fields. So the thinking was that the future of aviation would be on water, because there were lakes, most of the population of the world lives along a coastline, and that the future of aviation, again, would not be on land, but would be with seaplanes. Now, Jacques Schneider, who's a rich French financier, he is a balloonist, he's an aviation enthusiast, he says, I'm going to offer a prize. And it's going to be a big prize. It's going to be 1,000 pounds in 1913 for who can make the fastest, best seaplanes. And the race goes on for, I believe there were 13 total races. But the goal was if a team won the race 3 times in a row, they would be declared the ultimate winner, and that would be the end of the Schneider Trophy. So it becomes a race about, though eventually, pure speed. Well, the nations, the militaries of the world, they begin to throw some small financing into this. So in 1923, the United States will take one of its military naval aircraft, modify it for this race, and the United States will win the race. In 1925, the United States Army Air Corps gets involved. They take an Army fighter plane, they modify it into a seaplane, and it's flown by Jimmy Doolittle, and in 1925, Jimmy Doolittle wins the race. Again, all this is about trying to get financing from the government to support air power. Well, Doolittle, flying this thing, then takes it the next day and sets an absolute world speed record for level flight at 245 miles per hour. So pretty impressive for the time frame. But at that point, the United States withdraws. The United States military feels they cannot afford to be doing this. So what they do then is, there's only really two players in the Schneider Cup. That is Mussolini's Italy and the British. The British win 2 times in a row. They're up to win for the 3rd time, and they come out with this aircraft. It is the Supermarine S-6B. The Supermarine S-6B is made by a gentleman by the name of Mitchell. Mitchell will go on to design the Spitfire. This is powered by a Rolls-Royce R engine. The Rolls-Royce R engine will become the predecessor for the Merlin engine. So this aircraft is a direct predecessor of numerous aircraft from World War II. It is extremely important the way this thing was developed, and it sets a speed record in 1931, yes, of 407 miles per hour with those big pontoons on it. That's pretty impressive speed for an aircraft like this that's not a typical fighter aircraft to be able to do that. How does it do that? Well, it's very aerodynamic, but it also has that big old R engine in it. Well, the race is coming up in 1931. It's going to be held in England because they've won it 2 times in a row, so the race moves to wherever the winner is. And what happens then is the British government withdraws financial support to Supermarine and Rolls-Royce because the Depression is on, they don't have any money. A Lady Houston, this is amazing that somebody would do this, coughs up £100,000 to Rolls-Royce and to Supermarine so that the British can compete in this race. The race draws a crowd of 500,000 people to watch this race. And today that'd be crazy. But it's just so important how this thing worked out with all these developments. Just a little bit about the R engine. I'm not going to go into detail about how it transfers, but the fact of the matter is these engines are race engines. It can create, from a 12-cylinder engine, 2,500 horsepower in 1931. The problem with these kinds of engines is you can run them for about an hour and then they basically disintegrate. And they don't run on gasoline, by the way. They run on acetone, benzol, methanol, and I think about 4.2 cc's of tetraethyl lead per gallon thrown in for good luck. So these are strictly racing engines. There's only 19 of this engine ever made. It goes on to power a land vehicle that sets the world speed record. It goes on to power a speedboat that sets the world speed record for, so it's an amazing engine and certainly incredible design for its era. Well, I said about the Italians, and the Italians, they wanted to be in the 1931 race too with this aircraft, the MC-72. The MC-72 is an incredible design as well, but the MC-72 is so touchy, it kills 2 of its pilots trying to set the record. It does not finish the race because of engine issues, but it will eventually become amazing as we get to it, because it runs with 2 12-cylinder engines that are combined into one engine to make a 24-cylinder engine that's very thin. And since this engine is very thin, it's more streamlined. This engine can create 3,100 horsepower, but it's a twitchy airplane, to put it bluntly. So how does this engine really work? If we've got a front engine, the cylinders are going like this and they're turning a crankshaft. What they do is they put one engine, they share a lot of components, so don't get me wrong, many people consider this one engine, but it doesn't really work like one engine. One engine is turning a propeller one way, the other engine is turning the propeller the other way, so it has contra-rotating propellers. hugely advanced for its era. For example, we can see this on the Soviet Bear bomber that is still flying today. So this airplane is very, very streamlined, very, very powerful, has contra-rotating propellers, and in 1930, by the way, Mussolini wants to keep, even though the Snyder Trophy's over, Mussolini wants to keep the airspeed record. So he works on it, continues to fund it, and it sets a speed of 423 miles per hour in 1933. In 1934, they decide to keep working on it, and they actually get it up to 440.7 miles an hour. For 5 years, this is the fastest aircraft in the world. It's not surpassed until the ME-109R for race is created in 1939. Amazingly, this aircraft still holds the absolute speed record for a seaplane that's piston powered. No one has surpassed it with a piston powered engine. That brings us to one of my favorite people, Jimmy Doolittle. Those of you that are interested in early aviation, Jimmy wrote a biography right before his death. It's called I Could Never Be So Lucky Again. I would highly recommend, if you're interested in this topic, that you read his book. In 1913, I believe, 1910, Jimmy attends the first air race basically held in the United States in California, and he sees airplanes and he falls in love with airplanes. He thinks this is the coolest thing in the world. When the United States goes to war, he leaves college and joins and becomes an air cadet. He's an air cadet. He does not go to France to fight because he is such a great pilot that they decide that Jimmy Doolittle should be a trainer. After the war is over, remember the militaries are all downsizing, they decide that Jimmy Doolittle is so valuable that they give him a full commission in the United States Army. This is when the Army is shrinking radically. That's how important they view him. And he goes on to be basically an air racer. He's going to make the air races. He's going to be a tremendous winner. He wins the big three. He wins the Thompson Trophy, the Bendix Trophy, and the Schneider Trophy. And at that point, he decides he is going to quit air racing, and he says this: I have yet to hear anyone engaged in this work dying of old age. So remember I showed you the GB Racer. After he won the race, he landed the GB Racer, he got out of the airplane and said, I will never fly that plane again. So it's not exactly a healthy business. But the other thing he is, besides being what many people think to be the world's greatest pilot, is Jimmy Doolittle is a tremendous engineer. And Jimmy Doolittle, in 1924, gets his master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and then becomes, in 1925, the first person to get a doctorate in aeronautical engineering in the United States. Quite an accomplishment for this guy. Yes?
Where did he get those degrees?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sure I could figure it out. I think it was MIT, but I'm not sure. Well, Jimmy says this about engineering and pilots. He goes, in the early 20s, there was not complete support between the flyers and the engineers. The pilots thought the engineers were a group of people who zipped slide rules back and forth, came out with erroneous results and bad aircraft. And the engineers thought, well, the pilots are crazy, otherwise they wouldn't be pilots. Well, Doolittle's most important contribution to aviation is actually something completely different. He is the person that decides that you cannot control an airplane if you can't see. If you can't see, the airplane can make maneuvers that your brain and your body can't comprehend. And this could cause you to have fatal accidents, and we still see this today. Now, I'll give you a great way to test this, if you don't want to believe me. If you have an office chair at home, and your office chair can spin 360 degrees, get in your office chair, sit in it, spin yourself around as fast as you can, and then pick up your legs and close your eyes. When you do that, open your eyes when you think the chair has stopped. I would bet money that chair is still spinning when you think that chair is stopped. I have tried this numerous times. Perhaps I wasn't the greatest employee at Kraft, spinning around in my office chair, but indeed, I would even try to wait and think, well, I got to be stopped by now, right? Never succeed. So your brain won't comprehend without your eyes. Well, he comes up with some things that are very important. The artificial horizon comes from Jimmy Doolittle. The directional gyroscope comes from Jimmy Doolittle. He makes aviation safe. The airliners you fly in today are all because of people like him doing this kind of work. And by the way, he's the first person to take off and land completely blind in an aircraft. And this makes huge, huge news. And what happens then? Well, now he wins the Harmon Trophy. So there's literally nothing this guy doesn't win. He also, when he gives up his commission in the military because he doesn't want to race anymore and because he can get a better job, basically, he goes to work for Shell Oil. And when he's working for Shell Oil, he will help to develop something that is incredibly important to World War II, 100-octane aviation fuel. And with that, let's take a short break. This is a great time for me to stop, even though it's a little early. But I've got a lot more to go, so don't take too long. The next thing we're going to talk about today is this gentleman, Julio Duhay. And Duhay is a proponent of strategic bombing. He is a major proponent of strategic bombing. And Duhay thinks that since aircraft function in a three-dimensional world, they are the most important aspect of the military. Because, first of all, because the sky is so vast, they will be difficult to stop. And second of all, that they will be able to bombard navies and the military on the ground and beat them into submission once they've established air superiority. So what he wants to do is he thinks that the first thing any military should do is launch an all-out assault on their air force. Once you've destroyed their air force, then everything else will become subject to bombardment. He has some other ideas as well as far as bombardment. He wants to go after industry, transport, infrastructure, communications, government, and the will of the people. He believes in destroying the morale of nations. And the way he's going to do that is once he's gained air superiority, he is going to bombard cities. He's going to deprive people of consumer goods. He's going to just burn their houses down until they are so unhappy, their morale is so shattered that they will revolt against their own government. And indeed, that's his plan. He says we're going to destroy people's will to fight until they literally beg their government or overthrow it to surrender. So he advocates what will be commonly known as total war. Not just war against the militaries, but war against the entire structure of nations. The United States has a little different idea about this. Don't get me wrong. The United States certainly believes in strategic bombing, not necessarily morale strategic bombing, but strategic bombing to destroy the industries of nations. But they can't really sell that. What they can do, well, the reason they can't sell that is because the United States is too far away from the continent of Europe to be subject to bombardment. But what they will try to sell is the fact that they need to defend our coastline from invasion. And there will be tests right after World War I. Well, after World War I, there's a significant surplus of old naval vessels. And also we received naval vessels from the Germans as war reparations. Well, the Navy begins to run tests on bombing. They don't really do this very seriously. They drop sand bombs on them. And they also actually set detonations inside the ships because the airplanes were incapable of sinking them. So we're just going to blow them up and sink them and get rid of them anyway. Well, the press finds out about these tests being rigged so incredibly poorly, and what they do is it causes a giant scandal. This allows the United States Army Air Corps to become part of these tests. And they are going to make a test against a former German dreadnought battleship, the Ostfriesland. And the Navy once again sets up the tests. And the Navy's got it kind of rigged again. Not as nearly as bad, but they still kind of favor the Navy. And after 3 days of bombardment on the battleship Ostfriesland, the airmen, the Army Air Corps guys decide, you know, we've had enough of this, and they just sink the damn thing. So they break the rules. Well, this causes another huge scandal. And if you see from 1921 Chicago Tribune article, you see at the top the Navy guy going, well, you know, it was a stationary battleship, it was defenseless. Certainly, you know, it's certainly not a proof that a battleship is subject to aerial bombardment and can be destroyed. And of course, the lower picture says, with the airmen, well, we did sink it, didn't we? So you see this is a huge controversy going on in the United States at this time. Well, the test becomes highly influential, and funding does get sent to the Army Air Corps to continue working on improvements in aircraft. And the Navy also starts to think about this as well and say, you know, well, maybe we really do need to put a little more effort into naval air power. And the General Billy Mitchell, I think most people are familiar with him, but Billy Mitchell says this. He goes, sea craft of all kinds, up to and including the most modern battleships, can be destroyed easily by bombs dropped from aircraft, and further, that the most effective means of destruction are bombs. They demonstrated beyond a doubt, given sufficient bombing planes and an adequate air force, aircraft constitute a positive defense of our country against hostile invasion. So the whole goal of the United States Army Air Corps is to sell bombing aircraft to defend our coasts. But indeed, they have other things that they have in mind as well. That brings us 1933 to the first modern bomber. This is the Martin B-10. The Martin B-10 you can see, is made of metal. It has an enclosed cockpit. It has gun turrets that are enclosed. It's very, very similar to what we'd expect an aircraft to look like in World War II. And it makes every other bomber in the world obsolete. Well, it's a private venture by Martin Company, and they come up with this thing, and they put a pair of 675 horsepower engines. I know that may seem light compared to what we've talked about earlier, but these are engines that are reliable and actually can be used for more than an hour. And it flies at 197 miles an hour, and it's incredibly big leap, so much so that Hap Arnold, one of the heads of the Army Air Corps in World War II, will say that it's a wonder. It is half again as fast as its nearest biplane competitive bomber, and it's faster than any fighter in the world. And the development of bombers of this type will lead to the thinking that the bomber will always get through. That we'll talk about that more shortly.
Was that faster than contemporary fighters with full bomb load? Was it faster with the full bomb load?
No. It would not be faster with a full bomb load. That would add weight. Aircraft, the minute you drop a bomb, always rise. So as soon as any weight you can take off an aircraft, it's going to probably go faster, unless it destroys itself. Which, well, P-38s had a little tail problem back in the day. So there's certain aerodynamics where you can only go so fast, but indeed, the less weight you have on an aircraft, generally the faster it's going to go. So, but it is, for 1933, that's mighty damn fast, okay? Well, in 1934, only 1 year later, after they've introduced the B-10, the United States Army Air Corps puts out an RFP, a request for proposal, for a new aircraft because the B-10 doesn't have a lot of range. And the United States is large and we want to control Canada and South America, so they want an aircraft with more range. And they come out with a very, very, I think, modest proposal. What they want is an airplane that can fly 200 miles an hour. It will carry what's, quote, a useful bomb load, and it will have a range of 2,000 miles. Well, the RFP is answered by the Boeing company, and they make the Model 299. The Model 299 is a 4-engine bomber. Many of the same attributes as of the B-10, but because it has 4 engines and even more up-to-date, it's a really great design, let's put it that way. It is going to be tested at Wright Field in Ohio. It flies from Seattle, where it's created, to Wright Field at an average speed of 252 miles an hour. It is beating the competition like a drum. But what happens is, oh, by the way, the Army Air Corps really wants to buy this plane. They love the Model 299. And what happens is the control surfaces, when you land an airplane and park it, you lock the control surfaces so that wind, storm comes up or something, doesn't damage the control surfaces. The crew gets in the aircraft, they forget to unlock the control surfaces, they take off and the plane shortly crashes. Because it crashed so quickly, it is no longer able to be used as part of the test, and so it fails. The Army buys a very, very inferior aircraft called the B-18 Bolo. Those World War II aficionados out here, I'm sure, are very familiar with that craft. We bought about 300 of them, and they were never really used much. But there is a little thing in the budget where the Army Air Corps has some money for experimental aircraft. They buy 13 Model 299s, and they rename them the YB-17, Y-1B-17. So indeed, this aircraft will become the very, very famous B-17 bomber. On one of its first missions, it is sent out to intercept and take photographs of an Italian ocean liner, the Rex, 600 miles off the coast of the United States. It does that very successfully, and it's used to show the population of the country that this aircraft will defend our coastline. Interestingly, the navigator on that aircraft, or one of those 3 aircraft, the lead navigator is Curtis LeMay, who you may be familiar with from World War II, or perhaps when he ran for vice president with George Wallace of Alabama. So Curtis LeMay has a long, long history in aviation and is very, very closely associated with the B-17. Well, I said the bomber will always get through. And that comes from this gentleman, Stanley Baldwin, who's the former Prime Minister of England. And he makes a very, very famous speech in '32, based on the theories of Douhet. He says that indeed bombers are going to be so powerful that they are going to cause a destruction of cities and perhaps civilization as well. And his speech goes like this: I think it is well also for the man of the street to realize that there is no power on earth that can protect him from being bombed. Whatever people may tell him, the bomber will always get through. The only defense is in offense, which means that you have to kill more women and children more quickly than the enemy if you want to save yourselves. If the conscience of the young men should ever come to feel with regard to this one instrument that it is evil and should go, the thing will be done. But if they do not feel like that, well, as I say, the future is in their hands. But when the next war comes and European civilization is wiped out, as it will be, and by no force more than that force, then do not let them lay blame on the old men. They alone are responsible for the terrors that have fallen upon the earth. So the bomber is seen in this era as the ultimate weapon, much like we would look at the hydrogen bomb today. This becomes part of mass culture, particularly in England. And I think that's partially due to the fact that the English had been bombed in World War I. And so there was a huge fear of bombing. And it's a recurrent theme, not just in Parliament, but in the media as well. As we'll see here, H.G. Wells, who's well known for his dystopian visions with things like The Time Machine, says, he writes a book called The Shape of Things to Come. And in 1936, this is decided to be turned into a movie. But the book doesn't really lend itself to being a movie. So they kind of rewrite it and change the name to Things to Come. And I've actually seen this movie when I was a young boy. I was probably 10 or 12 years old. And it had a profound effect on me, strangely enough. I still remember it vividly today, though I've never seen it again. But I do hear tell that you can watch this movie if you have Amazon Prime. So,
I've got it on the disc if you'd like to see it.
there you go. Thank you. But anyway, so then you're familiar with the plot of this movie. And what happens is this. The movie takes place from 1940 to 2036. And it is based on the fact that air power is going to destroy civilization and then rebuild it. And what happens in 1940, the world goes to war. Bombing aircraft begin to drop poison gas on cities and then eventually biological weapons. Half of the world's population is destroyed. The war goes on until 1960s. And at that point, people no longer even realize why they're fighting. And the world has entered a new dark age. It is then transformed by a group called World Communications, which I believe are in Iraq, strangely. And World Communications is a group of engineers and mechanics and aviators that are going to try to rebuild the world. And they call themselves Wings Over the World. So indeed, civilization begins to rebuild, and by 2036, they are ready to launch a mission to circle the moon, not to land on it, but to circle the moon. And what happens then is Luddites, I love that term. Hopefully everybody knows what a Luddite is and where they come from. England, by the way. They decide they're going to stop this progress that's out of control. So it's typical H.G. Wells and very dystopian, but it really had an amazing effect on me as a youngster to watch this movie. So you might want to see it. Well, the next big thing is going to be radar. Radar is surprisingly, everybody's kind of trying to make radar before World War II. You can see that it's really involved with the Germans want to have radar and have some radars before World War II. The British have radar before World War II. The United States has dabbling in radar, and then when the British begin to give us some of their technology, we go gung-ho into radar. But not just us. The Soviet Union, Japan, Italy, France, and Sweden, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, everybody's trying to make radar. But nobody's talking about it. It's all a secret. So what happens basically is that only one country in the world before World War II and early in World War II will have radars that make a significant difference in the war. So radar, hopefully everybody knows, is radio detection and ranging, R-A-D-A-R. And it's first really shown to be a capability as early as 1904 by Christian Hausmeyer. And he can detect metal objects with radio waves. He can't tell how far away they are, but he knows that he can detect them. So the idea with him is that for ships in the sea, if it's foggy, you will be able to see a ship, and you'd be able to prevent shipwrecks that way. But again, it's not truly radar because he has no way to tell the distance. Well, of course, the missing technique is going to be the fact that he's using wavelengths. In the United States, I believe it's the Navy group, they start to use pulses. So what happens is they shoot a pulse out, and then it's reflected off the thing, and the time it takes to come back can help you to tell the distance or the altitude of things. And indeed, that is now started to be copied by the British, the Signals Experimental Establishment in 1931. They start to work on this, and they've got a prototype system. Of course, the British Army is completely not interested. They see no reason for this at all, and they don't want to spend any money on it. So, indeed, that gets shelved. Well, what will eventually cause people to really, really get involved with radar is something that we've all seen with Flash Gordon, perhaps, is the death ray. And you can see a 1925 radio magazine photograph of Grindle Matthews' death ray. And there it is. It's ready to destroy humanity with radio beams. Well, needless to say, he tries to sell this thing to the United States government. The United States government says he's a fraud, and they throw him out. And indeed, he is a fraud. What else happens at this time, though, is there's this story that goes around in England. And I think this is pretty interesting. The story goes like this. There's a couple, and they're on vacation, and they're driving through the Black Forest, having a little motor car, and all of a sudden their car stops. And then German soldiers show up and say, "Don't worry about it. We're just running a little test. In a little while, your car will start again as soon as the test is over." And indeed, the test is over, their car restarts, and they drive off, and they tell the British government about this amazing story. That indeed, the Germans have capability to stop motors. If the Germans had capability to stop motors, they'd probably have to be using a hydrogen bomb that would emit an electromagnetic pulse. But needless to say, this story gets some credence in Britain, and the British feel like, uh-oh, we better do something about this because this will make our bombers non-effective. So in other words, they can't bomb people if they can't use their motors. So Britain's concerned. And then the RAF is concerned about death rays so much that they offer a prize of £1,000 to anybody that can kill a sheep at 100 yards with a death ray. Of course, it goes unclaimed. Well, what happens next is they start this thing called the Tizard Committee. And Tizard's a very famous British scientist. Plays a prominent part early in World War II with Britain. But they create this commission to look into these death rays and also to look into ways that they can use more effectively the science capability of radio and radio waves. And they bring in the guy at the top, Robert Watson Watt, who's very, very famous in this science. He's been detecting long-distance lightning strikes, for example, using radio. And they say to Watson Watt, they said, you know, we really want you to look into death rays. And he's like, oh, okay, you know. And what happens next is he gets this next guy, the lower guy, Arnold Wilkins, and Arnold Wilkins is also in this field and quite great at math. And Arnold Wilkins, he doesn't want to tell him what's going on. He doesn't want to say, well, this is important, and we're looking for death rays. So he says to Wilkins, you know, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to tell me how much radio energy it would take to heat 8 pints of water from 98 degrees to 105 degrees Fahrenheit at a range of 5 kilometers. And Wilkins hears this and says, oh, so you want me to look into death rays? And indeed, that's what he wants to do. So it doesn't fool him in any way. Well, Wilkins says, okay, here's the math on this. This can't be done. It's impossible. Well, what happens next is Watson Watt says, well, if we can't do a death ray, what can we do? And Wilkins says he's read a report from about radio from the GPO. Does anybody know what the GPO is?
Government Protection Office.
It's the General Post Office of England. The General Post Office of England obviously was somehow involved in radio at this time. I'm not sure why. Maybe they wanted to get rid of mail. But so anyway, the GPO has these studies, and he thinks to himself, he goes, well, you know, a wing of a bomber is about 82 feet. And what they're saying with the wavelength that they're using here, that would be just about the right size to reflect back a signal that indeed an airplane is coming. Well, what happens next is he tells Watson Watt. Watson Watt goes back to the Tizard Committee, and he gives them this sentence. I would never write a sentence like this. It's so English to me. But he says this: attention is being turned to the still difficult, but less unpromising, problem of radio detection and numerical considerations on the method of detection by the reflected radio waves will be submitted when required. That may not make a lot of sense to you and me, but what he's really saying there is, I can tell you this as soon as you give me some money. So, and indeed, they decide to give him the giant sum of 4,000 pounds. Woo-hoo. So, and also another person involved with this is Dowding. Dowding is Hugh Dowding, who will be in charge of fighter command during the Battle of Britain. And Hugh Dowding thinks this is a great idea, but you know, I'm not going to do anything with this until you can prove that you can actually do this. Well, you only got 4,000 pounds. So how are you going to prove this? So they find a radio transmitter in Daventry. This is known as the famous Daventry experiment. They find this radio transmitter, and then there's this van they get that is used to test the strength of radio signals in England. And they get a CRT, cathode ray tube. Of those of you that have television sets, the old style, you would know what that is. And they get an oscilloscope, and they then go to this field, and they put up some posts, and they run some wires. And then they get the RAF to let them have a Hayford bomber for a day, and the Hayford bomber flies back and forth. And indeed, they can see the Hayford bomber on that cathode ray tube. So it's a huge success. And the British government, in their incredible generosity, then gives them another 12,300 pounds. Again, this isn't a lot of money to create a radar system. But that's the best they can do at this 1935. Now, one other thing I wanted to share with you on this picture is the Hayford bomber was created in 1931. It's a contemporary of the Martin B-10 that was created in 1933. So you can see, quite honestly, how primitive the Hayford looks like compared to that B-10. So you get an idea of really what an advance that was for its time. Well, that brings us to the Navy. Yes?
I'm just going to say, for anyone who's interested in this, the location of that original radar site is still available to be visited in Norfolk.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all there is there is though is a stone plaque on the ground, really. There's not there's
I think some of the structure is still there.
I think you're talking about Chainholm. I think you're talking about the Chainholm radar system. That's after Daventry. We'll get there. I'm getting to Chainholm. I'll be there. Yeah, Chainholm is what they ended up making from Daventry. But the actual Daventry experiment, all that exists there is a simple plaque in the ground. Because there was nothing permanent made there.
I must have seen the other.
You're thinking of Chainholm, yeah. We'll get to Chainholm, believe me. Anyway, the next thing is going to be aircraft carriers. And we can see here the Argus. And the Argus really is the first flush deck aircraft carrier. There's some desire by the British to have aircraft carriers that have one big deck, because then they can land regular aircraft on these. And so it makes a lot of sense. But the idea is initially shelved. As World War I goes on, they decide to take an they take an Italian ocean liner that's under construction, and they begin to rebuild it. And they rebuild it into the Argus. and what will be the first actual flush deck aircraft carrier. And that's in 1916. They begin construction. The Argus is not completed until right before the end of World War I, just a couple weeks. So it never really is in battle in World War I. But the Argus does begin to show how aircraft carriers that we expect them to look like will indeed function. For example, arrestor wires are first tested on the Argus. So those are the wires that catch a plane and stop it before it goes too far on the deck. It is then used quite effectively in World War II, not as an aircraft carrier, but as an aircraft ferry. So it will be used to transport land aircraft from one location to another that's perhaps too far for them, like a fighter plane to fly. So, and the reason it's so effective is because it was made so early, it has a very, very large elevator for wings that don't fold. So it's got this big elevator so you can put regular land planes down below, put them in the lower part, put a bunch on the deck. When you get to your location, they can easily come up and then they fly off to where they need to be. So it's never really used as an aircraft carrier in wartime, but it is used as an aircraft ferry. So it had a relatively long life for as primitive as it really was. Well, that gets us to the Washington Naval Agreement of 1922. And the Washington Naval Agreement is basically about reducing the total number of warships and to prevent a future arms race in naval power. And what they do is they come up with what they call the very famous 5-5-3 ratio. So the British get the equivalent of 5 ships, or 5 of a type or whatever. It's most really by tonnage, but its percentages is 5-5-3. And then the US gets 5, the British gets 5, the Japanese get 3, and they're very unhappy about this. But aircraft carriers fall into a relatively special category. So even though aircraft carriers are brand new, they're still going to be limited by this treaty. But there's a clause in the treaty that allows for aircraft carriers to be converted from battleships. So everybody's got too many battleships. So instead of having to destroy all these ships, they are allowed to convert them. You can see in this picture the HMS Glorious on the top as it was built as a battle cruiser in World War I. You can see down below the picture of the same HMS Glorious has been converted to an aircraft carrier. Also notice the rectangle. Aircraft carriers at this time, because aircraft were so light and pretty much easy to take off, frequently had multiple flight decks. So you would land on the top and you could have planes take off from down below, right from the hangar deck. Of course, as aircraft get more powerful and heavier, you can no longer do that. But so many of these ships are converted to aircraft carriers. Well, an aircraft carrier is limited to 27,000 tons by the treaty. What happens then, though, is, of course, that there's a lot of clauses in this treaty. So a lot of these very early aircraft carriers, for example, the Furious, the Langley, the Hosho, the Argus, are declared experimental. So they don't count for your tonnage total. You're allowed to take 2 of your old battleships or battlecruisers and convert them. They don't count as your tonnage total. So even though the tonnage totals are relatively low at 135,000 and 81,000 tons for the Japanese, virtually every Navy exceeds this tonnage total by a relatively large amount by the start of World War II, and well within treaty rules. Well, the Japanese, because they have so much experience fighting in China, have realized that there needs to be a better use of aircraft carriers, that air power is actually more usable in mass. So the Japanese decide what they're going to do is they're going to be able to group carriers together. They're going to launch a unified airstrike for multiple carriers. So instead of the carriers each launching their own airstrike, they're going to form up in a big group, and this is much better as they prove this in China for land attack. Of course, later on they will use this same technique to attack Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese are pretty much involved with massing carriers. And you see the Akagi here. This is the Japanese carrier Akagi in a very early form as it was first made after World War I. The Akagi has 3 flight decks, which I think is very interesting. So you've got a lower one, a middle one, and then you've got the top deck where people can actually land. It also is armed with 8-inch guns. As you can see, the 2 circles for the gun turrets. The reason for that is at the time they didn't necessarily feel that aircraft carriers' aircraft could defend an aircraft carrier, so they thought it would be essential for carriers to have heavy cruiser-type armament. We see that same thing on the U.S. carriers Saratoga and Lexington, which are also converted battle cruisers. So no one really is solid as, and the Akagi will be completely rebuilt again and turned into one big long flush deck aircraft carrier. And of course those 8-inch guns will be removed. But we see that there's a lot of difference about how aircraft carriers are going to be built and used. And one of the things that the Japanese are so different is that the normal way to use an aircraft carrier for the United States and the British is to use the carrier as the eyes of the fleet. So you would assign a carrier basically to function as a scouting group. And then hopefully one of the airplanes might damage an enemy dreadnought. It would be able to then slow it down, then the rest of the battle fleet could catch up with it and destroy it. And we actually see this being done one time when the Bismarck is hit by a torpedo from a British Swordfish torpedo bomber from the Ark Royal. That slows the Bismarck, and then the Bismarck is destroyed by the British dreadnought fleet. So it does sort of work. But the Japanese, again, have come up with a much more aggressive use of aircraft carriers. Not to say they don't believe in the battleship, because they do. And they believe in the battle fleet as well. But what it demonstrates is we've talked about the Mahanian principles of the control of sea power through the battleship. The Japanese are going to be the first to demonstrate that the aircraft carrier is going to be the new ruler of the sea. So indeed, the Japanese are going to make they're still going to have Mahanian theories, but they are going to have a new way to implement those theories using air power. That brings us to Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard is the father of rocketry. Again, here's a person that's probably fairly well known today, but certainly in his own lifetime was considerably unknown. And Goddard, he's a physicist, he's a professor, he's an engineer, he's one of these, really a brilliant guy, but not a very good self-promoter. And he comes up with 214 patents. Some of his patents are multi-stage rockets, liquid fuel rockets. He is the first person to design and build and launch a successful liquid fuel rocket in 1926. He goes on to continue making rockets until 1941. And he has really always want to go into outer space. He always thought rockets were the way for us to escape the planet and for us to become a star power, if you'd like to look at it that way. Or he's really into that. He's really into like space flight. And his probably biggest single contribution is he comes up with the idea of a gyroscope connected to variable thrust nozzles on a rocket engine. So now you can guide that rocket the way, to where it needs to go. I'm sure many of you have been involved with launching a skyrocket in your life, and it doesn't necessarily go where you expect it to go. Well, Goddard is the person that will develop rockets that do go where you expect them to go. Well, like I said, he's kind of shy. He's not a self-publicist. He's kind of strange, I guess people looked at him. And they didn't think this was an appropriate thing for a physicist and a teacher to be doing, was to be playing around with these rockets and talking about space flight and all this stuff that really didn't make a lot of sense in the 1920s and 1930s. And he's ridiculed in the press. He's constantly struggling to get funding. He's given really no support whatsoever in this effort to create modern rocketry. And it's not till long after his death, really, that he's even really recognized for the kind of person he really was. But there's another group of people that really think that Robert Goddard's pretty cool. And that is Wernher von Braun and the Germans. They think, you know what, we really like this Goddard guy. He's got a lot going for him. And why is that? Well, Wernher von Braun, who many of you may be familiar with, he did, for a long time, work in Huntsville, Alabama, creating our missiles for intercontinental ICBMs and, of course, into the space program. Wernher von Braun is a good German, maybe. And he is being able to, the German military recruits him because there's a exception or an oversight, probably a better word, in the Treaty of Versailles. The Germans are not allowed to have heavy artillery. So the Germans are looking for a legal way to have heavy artillery, and the Treaty of Versailles says it's okay to have rockets, because rockets aren't really very dangerous. And the Germans are thinking, well, you know, we could probably use rockets to replace heavy artillery. So they begin to pour money into research into rockets. Unlike the United States and Goddard, the Germans start to fund this. And the German scientists, Wernher von Braun included, even though he will deny this after the war, begin to reach out to Goddard, begin to look at his reports, begin to look at everything that he has done, and start to translate that to information that they can use to make their own intercontinental, or, well, intermediate range would probably be better, intermediate range ballistic missiles. And indeed, von Braun will create the A series, and the A series will lead to the A4, and the A4 will become the very famous V2 rocket, which will be used to bombard Amsterdam, London, and other places like that. So von Braun is certainly, he denies the fact that he got a lot of his information from Goddard, but it's pretty well documented today that indeed he did. Well,
Where did Goddard teach?
I don't know off the top of my head. I could figure that out, though. Remind me before we go. So anyway, von Braun says this after the war, of course. Now, he's a good German. Okay, there was never any slave labor building those rockets. I have very deep and sincere regret for the victims of the V2 rockets, but there were victims on both sides. A war is a war, and when my country is at war, my duty is to help win that war. After hearing of the attack on London, he is quoted as saying, though I don't really believe this personally, that the rocket worked perfectly except for landing on the wrong planet. Well, Mort Saul, the famous satirist, says, as a response to mock von Braun, he goes, I aim at the stars, but sometimes I hit London. So it's really, I really debate a lot about von Braun's, but you know what, we did need the German technology to help our own missile base. So you kind of overlook some things. Now, I did not talk today about nuclear developments from 1903 to 1939. I will send my one session of my class on the atomic bomb out to you for those of you that have never taken my atomic bomb class. If you would like to watch that and see how the atomic bomb fell into this era, watch from 1903 till 1939 when Otto Hahn will have nuclear fission created at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, and that will catch you up to date with the atomic bomb in relation to this class. I will never really in this class talk about the atomic bomb because I've done an entire class on the atomic bomb, and I'm trying to do something a little bit different for those of you that have taken this, that class previously. But I will send that one session out to everybody, and you can watch it if you so choose. I will also send you out a little thing about the triode, and how the triode will lead into not just the triode, but into the transistor, which I think is very interesting as well. And I want to thank you all for coming today, and hopefully we'll see you all next week.